Good evening. This is Andre Smith, Executive Director of the Economic Justice Law Review. This is our periodic economic EJLR scholarship review. This is January 20th, 2021, a brand new day for a lot of people. It is Inauguration Day, but the scholarship never stops. So today we're reviewing what we teach when we teach about race, the problems of law and pseudo-economics. This was published several years ago in the 54th volume of the Journal of Legal Education, page 365, back in 2004, by Professor Stephen A. Ramirez. Steve was a professor at Washburn at the time. I believe he is now at Loyola University. Ordinarily, we, as the Economic Justice Law Review, as we are the repository of scholarship, the repository for scholarship focusing on race, economics, and law, we usually review new scholarship, but along a parallel track, we're going to start to do reviews of older, very impactful scholarship. And Stephen Ramirez, this paper is a classic when it comes to the critique of neoclassical economics and the camp known as law and economic theory, law and economic legal theory, right? So we're going to proceed with his Professor Ramirez. He critiques free market fundamentalism is what I'm going to call it. He doesn't call it that, but I'm going to call it his critique of free market fundamentalism to the extent it undergirds what is called law economics and the latter's aversion to civil rights legislation or any public governmental intervention in the name of racial justice. Okay. This conversation deals with first, his paper talks about, well, I'm going to introduce the economic basis for law and economic theory. Starts with Dr. Gary Becker, the Nobel Prize winner, the author of Economics of Race and Discrimination, because his paper or his theory that the market will eliminate racism has bled over to law and economic theory and why they believe government intervention into racial justice is so-called inefficient. So in the economics of race and discrimination, Gary Becker described racism as an irrational taste for disassociation with Black people. In other words, it's a cost or a value that they would pay for or this taste to disassociate with Black people. The inefficiency of this taste will cause non-racist firms solely focused on profit to outperform racist firms, right? Now, there's some truth to that, but Becker believes that that's a perfect explanation, and therefore civil rights legislation is unnecessary and actually harmful to the wealth of the country, according to Gary Becker. He's basically saying that the market will eliminate racism all by itself. This view of an idyllic and perfectly free and fair market invokes an image of a god named DeMarquette, who wields his invisible hand. For those that have studied economics, you know about the invisible hand. The view that whatever social order created by marketeers is perfect and never to be interfered with, in which we can then describe as free market fundamentalism. Yes, I do mean to describe it in somewhat religious terms. Now, John Donahue, and again, we're staying in economics. We'll go over to law in a second. John Donahue is also an economist. He critiqued Gary Becker. He said, even if civil rights legislation may be inefficient in the short run, he says it's like taking side streets to get on the highway. So even if you go the opposite direction, once you get on the highway, you're on a faster path than had you not. So on the one hand, you could wait for the market to eliminate racism, or you could take a somewhat painful or inefficient short sidestep, get on the highway and really move forward. Richard Epstein argued that some forms of racial discrimination are actually efficient. And in the 21st century, there's a lot of Black scholars that have pointed to many instances of racial capitalism, right? And then there's Richard McAdams, who I believe totally wrecked Gary Becker's theory entirely, although it survives. McAdams argues convincingly that racism concerns intragroup esteem via intergroup conflict, right? Intragroup esteem from your fellow mates, for winning conflict with outside groups, right? Intra-group esteem via intergroup conflict. After having criticized the notion that racism is a taste for disassociation by pointing to the fact that slave owners forced Black women to breastfeed their babies, right? That's not disassociation. That's the epitome of not disassociating. To McAdams, racism from an economic perspective is the value associated with whatever esteem the slave owner gets from other whites for his ability to take advantage of those outside of his group, and that, in this instance, Black people or Black women. Okay, so regardless of the critiques of free market fundamentalism, it crossed over from, hold on, I'm sorry. It crossed over from economics to legal theory and jurisprudence. Former University of Chicago law professor and chief judge of the Seventh Circuit Appellate Court, Richard A. Posner, in his influential Economics of the Law, and there's also another book that he wrote, Law, Pragmatism, and Democracy, that also advances a similar theory. Posit that there is nothing inefficient about racial discrimination, and that's hearkening to Richard Epstein, and that there are economic forces in competitive markets that tend to minimize discrimination, and that's a reference to Becker. So he references Epstein and Becker to say we don't need civil rights laws to end racism, and in fact, some forms of racism or racial discrimination are efficient. If Black people are quote unquote inferior for whatever reason, whether it be produced by society or innate, he argues that for business folks and for the wealth of the country, it's efficient to treat us as such, treat Black people as such. By holding out national wealth maximization as the highest concern virtually all citizens can agree upon, conservative ideology sought to take over what's so-called realist legal theory. Richard Posner and Gary Becker even operated an internet blog together for years. So Frank Easterbrook, there were other early proponents of law and economic theory. As a matter of fact, it comes in a lot of different modes. So there's Gary Becker's distaste for civil rights legislation. There's also free market fundamentalism in the Chicago School manifests in the works of Ronald Coase and his Coase theorem, which argues against any public accounting for transaction costs, externalities, and social costs. So we're talking about pollution, right? Things of that nature, crime, that it's no bother. If you're talking about the wealth of the country, it doesn't matter about those things, however it's distributed, right? Whether it's distributed only to poor people, whether it's distributed only to Black people, that's just not a concern for those who seek to maximize wealth. And then they'll also tag on to that a rising tide lifts all boats. This is also part of trickle-down theory, which argues that so long as America is the wealthiest country in the world, then those who are Black or poor or anybody within it still gets a boost to their lifestyle based on the wealth of the country, regardless of whether it's equally distributed or not. There's also the case of Citizens United, that petrifies wealth's control over politics, which emanates from Chicago School professor James Buchanan, whose work promotes public choice theory, which promotes the idea that legal rules are the product of a fundamentally free market in which groups compete for law and regulation, totally ignoring how much wealth can be deployed toward voter suppression, right? So public choice theory doesn't expect our legislators or political actors to account for everyone, that you buy senators more or less, you buy legislation, you lobby for it, and the spoils go to the victors, right? And so Citizens United allowing unlimited money in politics is a reflection of creating this totally free market where anybody with wealth or anyone has the liberty to affect it as much as they potentially can, as much as they are able. Okay, so those are by looking at law and legislation as a competitive environment by ignoring externalities and pollution and social costs, and then by assuming that non-racist firms will outcompete not racist firms. That uh, the confluence of those theories basically argues almost entirely against the recognition of race and racial injustice within the law. And therefore, law and economics and critical race theory are set against each other often. Now, again, in the end, I'm going to talk about the construct that we operate here in the Economic Justice Law Review of racial asymmetric market imperfections that looks to bridge the two. Okay. Now, in the critique of Steve Ramirez, however, is taking this challenge head on. He presents the works of an economist who counters Gary Becker, one of many economists that counter Gary Becker. This man's name is Kenneth Arrow, right? And he basically says, and this was written in 1998. What has economics to say about racial discrimination in the Journal of Economic Perspectives? He says, the neoclassical model of racial discrimination predicts the absence of the phenomenon it was designed to explain. How, if a free market full of liberty is going to eliminate racism, then how does it even exist in the first place? Then it wouldn't have existed to begin with. Right. So, and then he goes further. Other articles in the volume include William Darity. William Darity right now is probably the preeminent Black economist in the country. Evidence on discrimination in employment. Other articles within that very volume that Kenneth Arrow wrote talked about discrimination in consumer markets. There's been ample studies ever since then, over the last 25 to 30 years, talking about discrimination in car buying. Ian Ayers is a professor in Yale. Andrea Freeman, who I want to say she was at University of Hawaii, she might be at Cal Berkeley right now, recently wrote a paper, I think it was 2017, we reviewed it on the Economic Justice Law Review, about racism in the credit card industry. Daria Roithmeyer talked about the National Realtors Association and others, right? So, and you could all culminate that. You want to check out a non-legal text, a non-economic text, more polemic for your everyday reader. Sean Rochester's Black Tax, The Cost of Being Black, tries to assemble and compile so many studies about how much Black people are discriminated against in the economy and how much it costs. So Ramirez reports, this Professor Ramirez reports on several microeconomic critiques, the idea that critiques to the model. The idea that neither Blacks nor whites are perfectly rational beings. That's one of the reasons why racism exists in the marketplace, right? This idea that we're perfectly focused on profit as human beings is simply incorrect. Money that we get is used to satisfy our wants and needs and happiness that are greater than the money and the wealth itself, right? Nor is profit maximization the sole and preeminent goal. Black conservative view, the Black conservative viewpoint is offered by economist Glenn Loury, who uses the term self-confirming stereotypes. So on the one hand, Black people, he argues, can be irrational, or as I would say, there is an asymmetrical commitment to profit maximization based on the belief in the myth of Black inferiority. Albert Einstein has a quote about that, of how one of the biggest, the most pernicious aspects of racism is for Black people, or the objects of subordination, to believe in their own inferiority. So Glenn Loury describes the pervasiveness of racism and assigns it to Blacks themselves for being lazy, understandably lazy, but broken nonetheless. On the flip side, Daria Roithmeyer, who we just described, she describes white racial cartels, right? With respect to the National Realtors Associations, their conspiracy with the white owners to exclude blacks and others from their neighborhoods. We can go through the Ira Horowitzes, we can go through Richard Rothstein's. We can go through so many economic, even I wrote a book, Taxes, Death, and Trouble, Tax Law and the Racial Economic Justice, to show how many ways Juan Pareja's Doctrines of Delusion, with the debilitating effects of the GI Bill and how it was asymmetrically distributed. There's so many ways we can point to programs and institutions that that skewed the market towards racial wealth gap and racial subordination. Talking about racialized labor unions, Steve Ramirez writes specifically, any Southern storekeeper who hired a black manager in the 1930s risked not only diminished custom, but social ostracism and violence as well. Under such threat to self and family, it is unlikely that the store owner would ever seek to exploit any economic advantage that might be gained by hiring from underutilized labor pools. Right, so race treachery. There's so many ways in which humans, be they individual institutions or firms, do not act perfectly and efficiently, and therefore racism and racial discrimination can flourish within those gaps. In fact, we can even quantify or try to quantify. We can imagine it first, but then try to quantify it second. Racism produces macroeconomic inefficiency. So where Becker believes a market will eliminate racism, it is my belief, and it is the position of the Economic Justice Law Review, that the presence of racism necessarily means that you do not have a free and fair market. It is impossible to have. You have to eliminate racism in order for the market to work in the ways in which Posner, Epstein, and Becker assume that it assume that it ought to. Race causes suppressed and distorted market action, says Steve Ramirez. Cataloging all such mechanisms and quantifying their economic impact from a microeconomic perspective may well be impossible, but a more complete economic explanation is available from a macroeconomic point of view. And economists are beginning to assess race and economics from that perspective. The impact is so huge that it is hard to quantify. Perhaps the best starting point is the work of Andrew Brimmer. In a landmark study of the economic costs of racial discrimination against African Americans in the labor market, Brimmer concluded that the disparate treatment of blacks cost the American economy $241 billion in 1993. And this is not just the effect on black people. This is how much more the country could have made if black people were the talent, right? The talent that black people have, if it were deployed into the national marketplace. It's almost like having a ship. If America was a ship, and your strongest rowers, your best captains, I'm not a sailor, but those that know how to make a sailboat go or ship go fast are placed in jobs where they have no effect or even just thrown overboard, right? So that it hurts black people is one thing, but we're also talking about, as far as this macroeconomic effect, how much the country loses because of racial discrimination, right? You can also look at other studies that are years old. We need to update the works of David Miliband, Andrew Glenn, Elias Tuma, and others, right? And so racially asymmetric market imperfections, which is the rubric that we use, is my way of expanding what Steve Ramirez is talking about. A so-called free and fair market supposedly relies on the idea that everyone is a profit maximizer, right? That everyone is able to compete in the marketplace freely, that there's perfect market information available to everybody, and that there are no transaction costs like pollution and crime. But we know some people are more encouraged to enter into profit maximizing or businesses or lucrative opportunities than others. Others are squelched or discouraged. So we call that racially asymmetric profit maximization. And that can be voluntary or involuntary. Some Black people withdraw from the system because of its unfairness. There's also, again, we know that capital gaps, we know that discrimination causes, is part of the reason why Black people are unable to compete in the marketplace equally. And this is not just for jobs, but also, again, we have the Byron Allen case in Comcast versus NAAOM. There's discrimination in many settings, and we can call that racially asymmetric market competition, right? Then there's also stereotyping. There's a lack of education or asymmetric access to truthful information or asymmetric availability of untruthful information, right? And lastly, racially asymmetric transaction costs. So voter suppression, criminal justice zoning, and criminal justice penalties, environmental racism, to the extent that these transaction costs are distributed asymmetrically with respect to race. The four of these pillars, the four pillars of a fair and free market, are degraded, right? And they explain the extent to which not only is this not a fair and free market, it also describes the extent to which there is a macroeconomic harm or a drag on the nation's GDP, right? So Professor Ramirez writes, the pervasiveness of race is more pervasive than economics. It is manifest in incarceration rates, educational funding, life expectancy, medical care, standardized test scores, and even infant mortality. Racial discrimination, says Kenneth Arrow, pervades every aspect of a society in which it is found. And so we hold here at the EJLR that the economic effect of virtually every type and species of racism can be categorized in terms of racially asymmetric profit maximization, market competition, racially asymmetric market information, and racially asymmetric transaction costs. So that still leaves the question, will the Supreme Court recognize the benefits of racial economic diversity? And according to Ramirez, and again, this is written in 2004, so we kind of know the answer to that, but the court in Grutter versus Bollinger, again, this is one of the earlier affirmative action cases, articulated some of the stakes at issue in assessing the importance of diversity. It recognized that the business community needed more diversity to cope with an increasingly diverse business environment, that the military required diversity as a matter of national security, and that society in general needed visible diversity within its leadership as a matter of political legitimacy. However, the court is clearly weary of and reluctant to intervene on behalf of racial justice. So Steve Ramirez also writes, O'Connor seems to impose a time limit on the Grutter opinion. We expect that 25 years from now, she says, the use of racial preferences will no longer be necessary to further the interest approved today. Well, guess what? It's 2020. That 25 years is up, and the racial wealth gap is wider than it's ever been, right? Okay, so towards the legal recognition of racial subordination within legal jurisprudence, I argue that that CRT scholars or critical race scholars should more often deploy, let's say, Bob Jones versus U.S. for the proposition that Congress does not intend for its statutes to produce racial subordination, as well as the Commerce Clause for the proposition that proper within the necessary and proper clause, having been included in numerous corporate charters during the founding era, originally meant that federal legislation cannot unreasonably disadvantage a group of shareholders qua citizens, right? And so therefore, federal legislation, we should argue through these two cases, should be scuttled, or interpretations should be chosen that do not exacerbate the racial wealth gap, that do not create or exacerbate racially asymmetric market imperfections, not just because of the interest of Black people in our own capital improvement, but also because it creates a drag on the economy. Interesting thing about the necessary and proper clause, we're going to talk about that a little further, perhaps in our next video, because we're going to deal with Neil Buchanan's latest paper, 2020, that compares originalism and law economics. He calls them two kinds of formalism. And so we're going to address that paper as far as the economic justice law review going forward. Hope you enjoyed the EJLR breakdown of Steve Ramirez's The Problem of Law and Pseudo-Economics. So please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Hotep.